Worker exploitation is one of America's longest and most proud institutions. Kids these days may not know, with all their newfangled AI tech bubbles, but the speculative financial vehicle of the 1800s was silver and gold and other rocks, and rich people used to make much poorer people dig it out of the ground for them. Today's modern electronic horrors make me yearn for a time where the thing destroying the world was something you could actually hold in your hand, and not lunatics posting on the internet. So this drove me to create my own fictional mind filled with monsters and horror and snakes. So join me today for my process creating and illustrating some mutated mining professionals. My previous video, which was one part art process narration and one part complaining I've never convinced any of my friends to watch Deadwood with me, was this guy, Silas Telvis. Silas is an evil mining magnate that profits off of a magical ore extracted from the earth. Here he sits comfortably in his chair, pondering a piece of that ore. I based the ore off of real-life silver and made it green and glowing. I really liked how the ore snakes out of the rock here. Silas is a billionaire, however, so he needs a workforce that does all the heavy lifting. In order to complete this project, I would have to contrast his leisure with a horrifying reality of what it's like to extract a glowing precious metal from the bowels of the earth. So after I finished his illustration, I began hammering away at his labor force. I wanted 3 different types of guy to work the mine, each receiving a series of thumbnails that I would choose from and eventually turn into a finished character. First, a small worker who would be the most despondent and disposable of the group and will be the one doing most of the, actual mining. Next would be a security guard character. This guy would act as an enforcer or warden of sorts and keep all the smaller workers from getting out of line and enforcing the violent will of the bourgeoisie. And then finally, we'll have a larger pack mule creature that would transport the mined ore and complete the whole system of extraction. As discussed in the previous video, this project was loosely inspired by the television show Deadwood, and the character of billionaire George Hearst. Whereas last time I took inspiration from the man, this time I took inspiration from the mine that made him rich in the first place. I walked down to my local book retailer and bought a copy of The History of the Comstock Lode, and as an older Gen Z individual, I like to think I have a larger attention span because TikTok didn't come out until I was old enough to drink. But I have to admit, even I didn't surpass this text and finish it fully. It didn't help that as I began this project, Elden Ring Night Rain came out and caused what I would call significant production delays. From Software created the platonic idea of a witch character and put me significantly behind schedule. For the small boys, I thought it would be interesting for the spiral shape of the ore to be spurting out from their bodies, so the first few ideas had lots of spikes coming out of their eyes and skin and face holes. I wanted them to be mutated, but not so far from a natural human form that it was unrecognizable. Then I drew this worm character with his little feet dangling, and let me tell you, it was hitting the correct blend of funny and pathetic that I find myself drawn to. I also realized I could make him more snake-like in his finished form and continue with the snake motif I started when I placed this snake statue in their boss's illustration. For the medium-sized warden character, I needed a beefy, muscular boy to help reinforce workplace policy. Still working a lot with a spiral motif, but it didn't feel correct to have him in mutated pain since he's middle management and would be more content with his position. I did like this guy who was kind of like the hunter from Resident Evil but with a mustache, but ultimately I went with this fatter mustache man with a mouth on his stomach because greed or something. By the time we get to the big pack mule type beat, I'm basically making lizards with weird proportions and backpacks and saddles. Part of my research was watching this helpful YouTube video on the step-by-step process for creating a mine and extracting material from it. After ore is forcefully removed from its natural holding, it's usually taken away via some sort of conveyor belt to a refinement facility. I thought it would be cool if the big guys carried out the task of carrying out the ore from the mine, so most of these thumbnails were of larger creatures with backpacks or large hands or some sort of carrying system strapped to their frame. My favorite of these was Many Hands here because I enjoyed his odd serpentine form with the addition of human hands for extra ew. So now I have the 3 thumbnails that I can work with and start making the full character designs. For each of these boys, I begin with the same airbrush rough sketch I always do. I lay in the idea of the character very gesturally, so I have a framework to place details onto later. The small worker character gave me the most trouble. It took a few tries to get the correct worm balance in his pose. It was difficult correctly accounting for his weird proportions and center of balance. In the refined sketch, I give the small worker a goofy little face and a rough, worn hat. Hats are very important to the fashion of this 1800s time period, so all characters will be receiving one. I add in various worms and boils that dot his wrinkled skin, and I don him in a jacket that will allow me to break up his form so he isn't just a giant naked worm. Then I doodle in some small vestigial feet and top it off with a pickaxe to prove that he is a mining professional. I start with the warden's tiny head and small hat to contrast with his burly, muscular frame. The plan is for his mustache to be made of the spiraling ore because I think that would be fun. I spent some time trying to nail down what his underbelly is going to be. I wanted to give him an alligator-esque underside, one that feels armored and paler than the upper body, but I also tried to give it a pattern that kind of evokes intestines to complement his giant stomach mouth. So I go with this alternating pattern that wraps around said stomach mouth. His tail is adorned with spikes, and at the end I place a thagomizer to add to his threatening aura. Finally, he has some useless feet dangling from his body. But I forgot to record me sketching them, so here is a glimpse into the future with a more completed version of the character to see what those look like. I'm going for a serpentine kind of form for the long boy. I have him with a snaking neck and a stretched out face like he's been elongated by the mutation process. His body is a series of torsos connected to each other with arms that act as legs at each point, topped off with some saddlebags to show that his job is to carry stuff around. I also plan to give him a mustache just like the warden character, but this idea gets abandoned. Now all 3 refined sketches are done, so we move on to the line art. I'm going through each character with an opaque pen brush and making definitive decisions on where all the details are placed. In between line art passes, my infatuation with Elden Ring Night Rain persisted, and I painted this rendition of the Elden Ring witch character. As for color, I'm thinking of shades of green for these guys because I want them to be a bit snake-like in how they look. The worker is a light green with a brown jacket and hat. The warden, I begin with this incredibly saturated seaweed green that I will definitely be toning down later. And for Long, he's going to be a yellowish green with a lighter underside that's broken up by the brown bags on his back. Rendering-wise, I'm taking the same approach for each character. I start with a multiply layer for the shadow to block in basic lighting. Then I lay in softer gradients inside the shadow and lights to emphasize the focal points, like making the face and chest brighter than the tail on the worker here. Then I add some darker ambient occlusion in the pits and some rim light to cut out the form. Once that's complete, I go in and add all the slimy details like the highlights, blood, and boiled discharge. The small boy definitely goes the smoothest, and I get him into a finished state relatively easily, which is good because I need that time to fix the other 2 characters. After finally choosing a green for the big guy that doesn't make it look like he's a cartoon character trying to get out of going to school, I apply all the same rendering steps, with a couple of additions like rendering the metal jutting out of his body and giving his underbelly some texture. I tried out all sorts of color combinations and rendering techniques that would properly communicate the reptilian vibe that I wanted. I went through a few different ideas. The first was to add a scaly texture to the edge of the shadow, which was very tedious. I tried to utilize modern technology and created a pattern brush, but that just made it difficult to follow his form and get it to read correctly as a texture lying on top of his skin. It was then I saw this Dragon 3D model by A. Frank on ArtStation that had this wonderful scaling on the back of the character, so I yoinked that idea. I also approached what would be close to the final color scheme, a more yellow-green with a warm underbelly for contrast. For the long boy, I followed the same general path as I just described for the previous 2 characters. I gave him a shadow layer and some midtones throughout his body, and after that I put in the supporting details like ambient occlusion, highlights, boils, and wounds. However, as I was adding the finishing grime to his feet hands, I felt a little unsatisfied. I wasn't totally on board with how these guys looked at the moment, and I thought there was room for revisions to give them a bit more pizzazz. At this point in the project, I went on vacation, and I planned as my vacation activity to run through this Fundamentals of Creature Design book I've had sitting on my shelf for months. Imagine my horror when I read it and realized I was doing everything in the don't do this sections of the book. Given that Elden Ring Fortnite had already put me behind schedule, I thought, what was another week or 2 to revise and improve my boys? The main things I needed to focus on was balancing the shape language, harmony, and contrast. Like how I introduced this spiral shape into the warden's mustache, but then didn't continue that shape into the spikes that spread along his body. Visual ideas sprang up, but I wasn't connecting them throughout the character. So I reassessed all three to be more visually consistent and to be more readable from a glance. For the warden, all his green spikes now share the same spiral shape language, including the thagomizer. I made his hair red to make it so his hat and hair weren't the same color and blending into each other. Then I redid the scales on his body with line art so it was more unified in style with the rest of the character. And I made his mustache larger and more imposing. For the long boy, I redrew his spikes to be the spiral shape as well, which took a little while. His saddlebags opened so it would be a little bit more clear that it was the ore he's in charge of transporting. Then I added this brown gecko pattern to aid in the visual contrast through the character, and to make him not just a giant green worm. For the small guy, I realized I wasn't carrying this wormy, wrinkled shape language consistently. In his hands, feet, and tail, the pattern just suddenly stops despite being prominent in his torso. I made sure to continue those shapes all along his body, including his neck to put him in a little bit more of an uncomfortable position. His hands and feet also became less human-like and more malformed. I also added some of the metal jutting out of his hands so that shape was consistently spread throughout all three characters. With that, I have 3 final designs for each of the workers in the mine. Personally, I feel much better about where they landed after taking the time to revise them. As a friend once told me, never be afraid to start over. Now it's time for the next phase of the project, getting prepared for the actual illustration. Pretty much all of my previous illustrations have been in a 1920 by 1080 ratio. I realized at some point that I can do whatever I want, so for this illustration, I was going to orient the canvas vertically for a different sense of scale. I took the proportions of this cami print I have hanging on my wall and started doing some brainstorming sketches. Usually, I draw a few different compositions and choose the variation that is the most successful, just like I learned in school. But this time, I did just one because I had a fairly clear idea of what I wanted out of this drawing, so please don't tell the art police. I don't want Stan Prokopenko to flick charcoal dust in my eyes. To bring this compositional sketch to life, I began working on a 3D model. I started with a sphere that I subdivide to get more geometry to work with, and slop digital clay onto the sphere to pull, squish, and squash until the model is in the rough shape of a small worker. Then I get a new sphere and do the same thing to make the muscular warden and the lanky long boy. I know these don't look perfect, but I'm hoping my drawing ability is enough to get details like hands and feet. I looked up a quick Blender tutorial on how to rig models so I can move their arms and legs. I take each of them in their T-poses, add some pins, click a few buttons, and now they all have an armature that I can manipulate into a variety of poses. After the big, medium, and small guy are done, I place them to the side and begin creating the scenery that will surround them. I made a big plane and subdivided it a bunch of times and pulled out the cave that the mine will be created from. In the foreground, I placed a placeholder for the effigy that the foreground guy would be making an offering to. I futzed with the pose and angle of him a lot to get the precise position where his calls for mercy would look best from. From the half a book I read, a mining development I was interested in was something called square set timbering. I liked the visuals of this thing, so I modeled some square set timbering of my own, which were just rectangles I haphazardly joined together, resulting in this laddering kind of pattern. So I placed 2 of those into the background of the scene. From here, I dot the landscape with all the little creatures. I place these small workers on the timber like they're trying to reach high up ore deposits. These 2 will have unfortunately fallen into a lava pool and will be crying in agony. Then there's this guy who will be looking at the foreground character like, what are you doing? Get back to work. Stop fully comprehending the horror of your existence. Then of course we have the large pack mule guys walking along the timbering and carrying the ore out of the mine. While the 3D model was mostly done, I still needed to figure out what this statue in the foreground was going to look like. I went back and started hashing out a few thumbnails. I liked this idea the most of a improvised carved statue. Maybe the workers have taken excess rock and turned it into a shrine to the big snake god in the sky. I ran with that and developed a little totem for them to use as the mine's mental health services, though I went a little hog wild at the beginning and needed to tone it down so it would actually fit in the drawing I was making it for. And after I settled on a statue, I went and finished the 3D model reference, and with that, I was ready to begin the final illustration. However, It was at this point I bought a new computer to finish out the rest of this project. I was excited for this computer. My old computer was from the late 1800s, just like this drawing, so having a rig that could play Elden Ring Recluse Edition with greater efficiency was enticing. You may be wondering, why are you telling me this? Well, when I downloaded OBS again to record myself drawing, a gremlin crawled through my open window and changed OBS's output settings to record at 720p instead of 1080p. And because I am a master of perception, I did not notice this gremlin's prank until I write this very paragraph, meaning that all my footage for the final drawing is at a sizzling 720p, like it's 2013. Honestly, probably nobody cares but me, but my anger is nonetheless immense. But with the new computer and this setback aside, we move on to the illustration. In glorious 720p, I placed the 3D model into the scene and took a soft round brush to it and carved out some mutated forms for the rough sketch. As always, this is just to establish a base for the drawings that we will refine later. A fun challenge for me next time would be to create some 3D models that are even somewhat accurate to the proportions of the characters that I'm making. I kept having to make sweeping changes to the size of these things because the model is wildly off the concept. I color-coded each layer of the rough sketch appropriately and placed them into their own group in Photoshop. It makes it feel more professional this way, like this is the Photoshop document of a man who records in 1080p. Over top the initial rough sketch, I started to bring these characters kicking and screaming to life. In the foreground, I made sure to give our main star here all his wrinkles and folds, all the while he sobs in the face of an indifferent deity. Next, I draw his boss yelling at him and sternly glaring. He's subsequently ignoring that these two are burning in a pit and screaming for help. He's even ignoring that one of them has lost their hat. In the background, these characters are engaged in workplace harassment and laughing at this poor guy's cruel fate while a third naps on the ground. Then I refine all the background characters, laboring away. Next, I start working on the line art. I add in all the details of each of the creatures coming face to face with all their weird eyes and feet and grossness. On the sides and ceiling, I make some rock with ore spiraling out in this stalagmite kind of form. As with the sketch, we get a final pass of each of these characters in the foreground, middle ground, and background. The line art was a time sink that I severely underestimated. It's something that usually goes by pretty quickly, but this is already the most complex scene I've ever drawn, so I very much underestimated the rigor of inking each of these guys. I should have expected that everything is going to take longer when there's 20 weird freaks that need your attention. Next is to go through the entire drawing and set up the flat colors that I will be shading over top of. I've done a lot of complaining already, so I will skip commenting on the mind-numbing, purgatorial tedium of setting up the flats for this drawing. Needless to say, it was not my favorite 2 days of this project. By the end of the flats, I try to have a value separation between each part of the illustration. The foreground will be the brightest spot of the piece, with the midground a bit darker and the far background darker than that, so each layer of the illustration feels more in the distance than the last. I start rendering our star closest to the camera, giving him a basic shadow and letting the green shine through as the light hits the side of him. Then I add in a warm fill light from a lava pool or something that's just outside of the frame and get down some ambient occlusion for depth. Then I do the same steps for the snake statue and try to give it some sort of rocky, granular texture by messing with the shapes in the area where the shadow and light touch. I add in a rim light to get the character to stand out more from the background, an element that will work better once I add some atmospheric fog between the foreground and midground later. The big guy shaking his fist at the code of conduct violation gets his shadow pass. I get his stomach mouth crevices and all his little teeth, then move on to the torches in the background. I had an idea on how to render the torch light and I was anxious to see if it worked, so I decided to get the flames out of the way first so I could stop worrying. I laid in these sharp orange shapes, then used a soft brush to weave in the fire's flames, and added a glow effect behind it for some punch. In keeping with the warm theme, these two finally get their lava bath. A harsh warm light emanates from the lava pool below to give them a flashlight under the face effect, and look at that, aren't they just so happy? We move on to these two having a conversation about motivation in the workplace. I was going to have this guy hold a cat o' nine tails like in the concept, but it didn't really look right in the actual drawing. I just gave him a club with some spikes on the end to adjudicate HR disputes with. Then I finished it off with a snot bubble from this guy over here and another one laughing it up over here. I get a pass done on all the background characters. Since they are in the background, I'm a little bit more loose with their rendering. I have a soft warm light that comes from the torches hitting them, and an ambient occlusion shadow pass to once again get a better feeling of depth wherever the characters are standing. Next, I place this guy in a little sub-cave and give some texture to the walls around him so it looks like he's actually sitting underneath the opening. All the various workers climbing the timbering receive torchlight as well, and the very same lighting strategy occurs for the long guys once again, and I add in the lizard patterning to their skin as well. Next, I go in with a hard brush and start painting in some spiraling bits of ore peeking out of the cave ceiling in the background. I don't add line art to them like the ones closer to the camera because the contrast would bring too much attention to them, and I want them to be less conspicuous. At this point in the drawing, all the major elements are implemented, so we're really just refining details. I go around the painting, fixing some shading, adding highlights, and making sure all the gross purple boils are added to everyone who needs them. I stop procrastinating and render all the metal ore that's scattered over the painting. The main step is making sure that all these pieces of metal are receiving metallic rendering with highlights and strong reflected lights and all of that. It does occur to me that the ore probably wouldn't look this pristine after sitting in the ground for 1,000 years, but it probably wouldn't be green either. In the interest of not having the timber in the background be plain brown plains, I add a wood texture to my scaffolding. This really just amounts to adding a bunch of squiggly lines winding and looping around each other, along with the signature brown texture hole that appears in rough pieces of wood. This is the phase of the drawing called, "Oh God, what else does this need before I'm finished?" This part involves me scanning the drawing at 12:30 in the morning and realizing the jewels and the rocks need to be rendered, so I add some simple translucent rendering onto each of them. There are multiple times that I forgot I included purple jewels in the original concept for the ore and realized I needed to add it in. Speaking of purple, I forgot the veins on the foreground worker, which were a vital part to making the character feel as sickly as possible. I also somehow deleted the warm light layer on these guys. I don't know how that happened, but it's 12:30 a.m., so I hastily applied a rougher, sloppier version. I showed one of my friends the drawing at this stage, and they had a difficult time interpreting that the two bath buddies here were actually sitting in a lava pool because the rock in front of them covered the lava up. So I carved out more of the stone with the intention of revealing the tub they were sitting in. From a distance, it's now easier to tell that it's the lava encircling them. Then I upped the atmospheric perspective for the background characters. Everything looked like it was living in the same layer, and at a distance it was difficult to parse out. So I added a gray solid color layer and cut out everything from the foreground. An aspect of this drawing that had been irritating me the entire time was this flat, sand-colored plane hanging out right under my nose, stinking the whole place up. I started with some failed attempts at applying some texture to the shadow layer, but that didn't go anywhere. The wheels started turning after I messed with some brush settings and tried to spray down some pebbles in the affected area, which looked bad initially, but led to an actual solution. I painted some rocks on the ground one by one, using color dynamics to get every rock to be slightly varied. Then I used the drop shadow effect to give everything its own shadow automatically. I honestly should have just painted the whole thing by hand because I ended up needing to fix the wonky shadows anyway. There's probably a lesson in there about an honest day's work or something. We end this drawing by returning to 1080p because I finished this after discovering the gremlin's trickery by adding in some finishing touches. Some of the workers in the background felt a little too soft, and I added in some extra light to make their faces pop out a little bit more. I still want them to fade into the background, but I also don't want them to look like they're just artificially covered by a semi-transparent Photoshop layer, which they are. Then begins the actual final phase, combing through the entire piece with a fine-tooth comb and ironing out all the errant specks and unfilled spots that litter a painting at the end of the process. This is all done on one final Photoshop layer that sits on top of the entire painting. This is the same oddly satisfying feeling as vacuuming up a carpet and seeing all the dust and grime get wiped off the face of the earth. And after the last piece of lint is cleaned up, we have a final image to show off. This is by far the most intricate piece I've ever done, and finishes off the Eldritch Mine project that I started all the way back in February when I showed my friends on Discord a book I was reading. This project was a mix of my comfort zone, given that it was based off of my favorite TV show, and also spreading myself very thin over the past few months. So while I did enjoy working on it, I'm happy to move on to other things while also being satisfied that it's finished. I hope you enjoyed walking through this process with me. I'll see you next time, and thank you for watching.